Well, hello and welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Today, the Illinois budget. Oh, the Illinois budget. By almost any account, the Illinois budget is a mess. Lawmakers have adjourned last month. Back in May, they passed a budget with a $13 billion shortfall, which Business Week described as a budget built on borrowing, unpaid bills, one-time revenue maneuvers. So what are the alternatives? Well, alternatives to address Illinois' budget woes are unpopular, let's say, and controversial. Public services, including education and healthcare, are already suffering shortfalls, and the idea of further cutbacks is pretty much unimaginable to a lot of people. So what about raising revenues? Well, raising revenues through tax increases, let's just say, not too popular. Joining us today to discuss this situation are Dea Meyer. She's the Executive Vice President of the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago. And also we're being joined by Ralph Martire, who is Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability for the City of Chicago. And welcome both to Chicago Newsroom. Glad to have you here today. We just got some news the other day that on top of everything else, Moody's has lowered the bond rating for Illinois, which is going to make it even more difficult to get hold of money, I assume. What I'd like to do today is to try to paint the big picture and try to get a sense of where we are and whether there is any hope for getting out of this mess. Ralph, could we start with you? Could you give us the sort of the view from 10,000 feet? $13 billion deficit?
Yeah, $13 billion deficit in a general fund that's about $26 billion. So, you know, net, we on an ongoing basis don't have about half the revenue we need to provide the level of services we claim we're going to provide.
Let's just stop you right there. Let's just stop there. Did you say half? Did you say 50%?
Yeah, and some of this obviously is a buildup of bills we haven't paid for a long time. We have about a $6 billion backlog of unpaid bills, and we've got about another $3.5 billion they claim we owe the pension system this year. I say they claim because they lowered their pension payment by about $700 million, although as far as I'm concerned, they didn't have the right to do that. They just did it. So that's money that's completely unaccounted for in the budget. Then they claim on top of these holes that they don't know how to pay for the $6 billion in backlog bills nor the $3.5 billion that they owe the pension system. They claim they're going to allocate another $26 billion to public services. And I want to be very clear what I mean by that. 9 out of $10 in our general fund goes to just 4 things. And in declining order, they are education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. So that's 90% of the budget. So whenever you talk about cutting to sort of bring the budget more into balance, you're talking about cutting education, health, human services, and public safety.
Let's just hold that thought for a second, because I want to try to still, I'm imagining viewers tuning into this and eyes already glazing over, like, oh, they're talking billions of dollars. I have no idea what they're talking about. I need to get a sense of what this Illinois budget is about. Dea, maybe you can help. What are the revenues? How much money comes in every year? Do we know that?
Well, we do, and I think that right now the revenues are down. Historically, the big income tax is your big one, sales tax, variety of other revenues come in, but your big ones are income and sales. They're down. Right now you're looking at about $26 billion, maybe 28, depending upon who's counting, and that those are the revenues that we use to operate the general state budget. There are other funds that come in from the federal government and others that are outside what's known as the general funds budget. We have an all funds budget and a general funds budget. In essence, it's about double what the other piece is. And those funds are allocated directly, either by mandate from the federal government or by state government, the laws that were passed previously.
So those are things that the legislature can't really control. I'm imagining things like, I don't know, police officers or something. Is that those are the kinds of things that are mandated?
Federal money for transportation. It could be federal money for education. A variety of types of other programs like that. Medicaid dollars that are coming in.
I see. So like direct pass-through kinds of things. Like
in many instances, there are. Other times, there are funds that were set up by separate laws that were passed by the legislature that have a direct revenue source, whether it's money from the gas tax or otherwise, that go directly to another program.
Okay, but now let's try to stay on this for just a second. You said that revenues are down from the most important thing, which is taxes.
Right.
Is it a significant drop? Is it enough to make a huge difference?
Well, I think I'm forgetting the exact percent. You may be able to remind me at this point, but yes, it has had an impact on the state operations over the last couple of years.
Well, yeah, especially when you're expecting revenue growth. I mean, the bottom line is revenues and expenditures are supposed to be pretty close to the exact same thing every year, right? And you're supposed to be
That would be nice.
expending a budget that's predicated on your recurring tax revenue. That's the only sustainable way to provide public services over time. And the problem in the state of Illinois has been really for decades, they've had a spending level that's over and above what their recurring revenues will support on an ongoing basis if you just adjust for two things, inflation and population growth. So even if the state didn't bother to add a program or expand a program over time, it still wouldn't have the recurring revenue from year to year to maintain service levels from year to year. This, in turn, has led to some of the biggest irresponsible fiscal practices the state has adopted. Number one amongst these irresponsible practices is an intentional underfunding of the normal cost, that is the current cost they have to put into their pension systems to fund the promised benefit. They haven't been doing that for 30 years, and really, even when they said they were being responsible, back in 1995, they passed this pension funding reform bill. It's frequently called the pension ramp, where they said over time we're going to be 90% funded over a 45-year cycle. We're going to make up for past sins. This responsible funding bill intentionally underfunded the pensions for 15 years. It intentionally grew the state's unfunded liability from around $10 billion when the ramp started to $44 billion when the ramp ended. And then the markets crashed. So our unfunded liability jumped from $44 billion to about $73 billion overnight because the value of the assets that we had built up declined by close to 50%.
In addition, there were a couple years where they didn't make the contributions that were even called for under the ramp.
Right.
And so what that did was exacerbate it to such an extent that it got even larger than what was called under the ramp. The ramp was not actuarially based, and therefore put the system in a difficult spot.
Okay, now, you're starting to lose me a little bit here. We have a budget that is predicated on the idea that the state must provide specific services, and you've already enumerated those. We have revenue that comes in from federal sources, from taxes and other places and so forth. But in addition to that, and it seems to be something that is kind of like almost a separate bucket, we have this monstrous, ongoing, and seemingly always inflating issue of pensions. And we've been hearing more and more about it in the last couple of years, although, as you say, it's been debated for 30 or more years. Why is it so much of a bigger issue and a bigger problem today than it was 5 years ago or before?
What was it?
I think there are two things. I mean, one we talked about. One is that the ramp that was adopted in '95 was not actuarial based, so therefore the money that was going in was not sufficient to meet the obligations of the pension fund going forward, and increasingly put the state having to put in larger and larger shares of the general fund's budget to cover the pensions. Secondly, you had pension holidays in a couple years during the Blagojevich administration. And
What's
then,
a pension holiday?
Well, that's when you don't pay what you're supposed to pay.
It's
As
a
opposed to
holiday.
running to Vegas with the pension fund.
So you don't pay that, and you use the money for other state programs. And then, in addition to that, what they did in those years when they did the pension holiday, what they did was they borrowed pension bonds, and in essence took a hard debt and converted it, soft debt, and converted it into hard debt. And they used that as an excuse not to put in the state contribution. And what you really need to do when you've got a pension is pay for the normal cost, which is what you should cover all your employees this year, what they've earned under the pension system. And then to the extent that you have an obligation, an unfunded obligation, you should amortize it like a mortgage.
Right.
And what they have done is they haven't necessarily done normal costs, and they haven't amortized the mortgage.
And isn't that what we're doing this year? I mean, isn't that what's on the table now?
Yeah, it's on the table this year to do it again. And
let's be specific about where we're at right now. There's an unfunded pension liability on the table, and as I understand it, the House came up with an idea to basically borrow that money, but the Senate hasn't yet. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. But I want to be very clear on the growth in this unfunded liability. I mean, for decades, what they intentionally did by law was not put into the system the amount they had to put in every year just to cover the benefits promised to current employees. They did this by law. Knowing they were growing an unfunded liability, they were back-loading the costs.
This is kicking the can down the road.
Kicking the can down the road, but kicking it down the road in such a way that when you start making up for this 15-year period of underfunding, your payments go up very much from year to year in a way that your revenue growth could never match. It was highly irresponsible. Frankly, it was a fraud on the taxpayers and voters of Illinois, and it contributed significantly to the current crisis that we're in. Here's the kicker. The reason they did that was they never had enough money to fund their pensions to begin with and continue paying for their current level of services. So
they knew this.
They knew this.
Yeah, they knew.
That was the problem. They passed this quote-unquote funding scheme without passing the revenue to pay for it. They still had the same flawed revenue scheme, no new money coming in, huge backloading of costs, and the whole concept was to be able to divert money they knew they should have been putting into their pension system to cover basic public services. Go back to education, health, human services, and public safety, using it essentially very much like a credit card, building up compounded interest on the unfunded liability for decades.
I think the other thing is that what you found is over that time you had also larger growth in the healthcare side. Education, a lot of money has gone into education since 95, 96 that have exceeded inflation. So that you've ended up, what we've found is that it's very hard for people to say no. And that the notion is
politicians.
for politicians, so that what there has been is sort of this continued effort to add new programs and support people, the citizens, without actually balancing the budget at the same time.
Well, but to get to that, though, our spending levels in Illinois are low, no matter how you compare us to other states. I mean, as a percentage of our state GDP in general fund expenditures, we rank 45th in the nation. When you look at us compared to other states and the effort we make in things like education and human services, we rank in the bottom 5 to 10 of every state in the nation in state effort in funding those things versus other local sources, et cetera, funding those things.
All right, Dea, go ahead.
I want to get to the ramp up or the increase in spending because, I think that argument really doesn't fly. So at least from the year, we just look at decades at a time, from the year 2000 to the year 2010, after you adjust for inflation and population growth, state spending is down on education. State spending is down on human services. State spending is down on public safety. State spending is up on health care, primarily Medicaid, but not from state tax dollars. We've done a wonderful job leveraging federal money in through the match program. So over a period of time, we increased our state investment by $800 million in this, and that has leveraged well over $2.5 billion in federal dollars coming into our state to support our health care needs. So it's been a very wise and sound investment. Net, 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 Illinois is a very low spending state. We're a very low taxing state. We have the 5th largest economy. We have the 5th largest population. So what you see is we have a tax system that in the 5th largest state in the nation can't afford allowing the state to remain 45th in spending. There you go. So if you think 45th in spending overall is too high, by all means, let's start slashing these things even more than where they are now. If you don't think that's too high in spending, especially given the size of our population and economy, then maybe we got to put that tax side right on the table, the politically difficult side. The reason legislators kicked the can down the road on pensions and everything else is because they didn't want to tell taxpayers and voters, gee, you want public services, you got to pay for them.
Well, obviously this is, I know, Dea, you want to get in on this too, but I mean, I think that we need to sort of pause here and take a look at the situation from the perspective of your average politician. You've got constituents telling you we're taxed enough already. I think that's the TEA, isn't that what that is? You have politicians telling you you have constituents telling you we want more services, and the services we're getting aren't enough, and you have to figure out some way to make that happen. And so your alternatives are to tell people, no, we're going to have to cut services, or no, we're going to have to raise your taxes. And I don't believe there are too many politicians willing to do either of those at this point. Right?
I think what there has to be is actually, I think, a couple of different things. One, on the budget is transparency. I mean, very few people understand what's happening in the budget. You can't.
That's
I mean,
for sure.
and so that people don't understand actually what the revenues are, what the expenses are, how they're allocated, and to get it on a real-time basis.
Some of our state legislators
I think
don't
it's very
really
difficult to
understand
tell, and we've certainly been calling to be able to have it so you can have real-time operating statements to figure out actually what's happening in your budget. Secondly, in terms of the tax burden, you've got to. Ralph is historically not been a supporter of the property tax and our over-reliance on it, but it has to be considered in terms of aggregate funding. And that Illinois is sort of in the moderate of the tax basis right now in terms of the personal income tax. If you consider the revenues that are included on the local basis in terms of school funding, we're really in the middle. But what we have is a hidden tax, is that basically we've now developed this budget. We have a deficit, we have a liability on our balance sheet of, in aggregate, between $140 and $150 billion, depending on how you're adding in pensions, retiree health care obligations, unpaid bills,
sort of
the current budget,
sort of a
the
ghost item in the budget.
Right, and that as you're looking at this, and in terms of corporate taxes, we're actually on a percentage basis among the higher ones, but that the reality is that the operations of the state aren't run efficiently, and that there are changes that can be made in terms of how we look at the pensions. The truth is, in many instances, we have not funded the pensions. The other truth is we're broke. We have a liability on a retiree-related basis equal to $25,000 per household. And from our standpoint is that they did pass a pension reform bill this year, which was a step, but it was for employees going forward. It has no impact on the $130 billion of retiree-related obligations. And that going forward, we think that what you have to do is everybody has earned what they've earned to date, contractual right. But going forward, you got to scale back a little bit. And it's still defined benefit. It's still much richer than many of the taxpayers. Is it ideal? Of course not. But it's something that's going to have to be done if we're going to be competitive.
So were we wrong as a state historically to offer these pensions to all of our public service employees?
The truth is that times have changed. The private sector used to have them, and it was the way of the world. People didn't live as long either, and people didn't retire at 55. If they retired at 55, the life expectancy wasn't another 20 some odd years. The truth is that these are things that are not affordable. We fully believe that the state's got the obligation and we should fund them. But we have to basically review all state programs and determine how can they be delivered more effectively. Looking at, on the pension side, retiree health care for state workers is the benefits if you've been there 20 years, you can retire at 55 and 100% of your health care is paid for. That is, it's a great opportunity, but the truth is that we can't afford that. The teachers are not included in that. Many state employees are not included, but some are, and that's very costly. In addition, Medicaid should be reviewed in terms of the ways it's delivered. There may be ways that can be delivered better for the patients as well as for the state budget.
Ralph, I know that the term gold-plated has been used to
Yeah,
describe,
well, it's nonsense. When you compare the weighted average pension benefit in the state of Illinois for retirees, it's about $28,000 a year across all the systems, including everybody in there. It's $28,000 a year. When you compare us to the rest of the nation, it's interesting. Before we went to a two-tier system, our one-tier defined benefit system here in Illinois paid a lower benefit than the fifth tier did in the state of New York, for example. And a defined benefit system, when other states have tried to get away from that, like Nebraska, a pretty conservative Republican state, went from a defined benefit system to a defined contribution system back in the 60s, they switched back to defined benefit recently. Why? They found two things which are compelling in my standpoint from a public sector. Number one, the benefit was significantly lower, so much lower for their retirees that many of them were living in poverty. Number two, the cost was higher. So great, a higher cost to taxpayers and a lower benefit to workers. I'm wondering where the win is in that. That sounds like a lose-lose. And you got to remember, retirees are a big part of your economy. So if you're taking money out of their pocket, you're pretty much taking direct expenditures out of your local economy. It's a really foolish thing to do. And yes, the private sector moved away from the defined benefit sector benefits, but primarily because federal tax law changed under ERISA, creating huge problems for the private sector if they didn't fund it. ERISA doesn't apply to the public sector. Defined benefits, when funded, are the best system both for the worker and for the taxpayer. They're much lower cost, they're much lower cost administratively, and they work. And the benefit levels were never high in Illinois. The employee levels were never high in Illinois. And what we find frustrating at CTBA is all the talk focuses on changing aspects of the pension system that didn't cause the problem. The problem was caused because the state didn't put its contribution in. It didn't put its contribution in for decades. It did that because it was diverting spending to education, health, human services, and public safety. We're a low spending state in all those areas, and I'm going to talk about the tax burden in just a second. And we've never had the political will to raise the tax revenue necessary to even be an adequate spending state in any of those areas. So let's talk about tax burden, because I want to talk about that real quick. We look at everything when we consider tax burden, not just state taxes, we look at local taxes. And not just state taxes and local taxes, we include fees. So if you look at every tax and fee charged by any unit of state or local government in Illinois as a percentage of income, which is the only way you can compare us to other states, we rank 46th in tax burden. 46th. That we have the lowest tax burden in the entire Midwest, well, fourth lowest tax burden in the entire nation. Yet despite this advantageous tax burden, so to speak, right, you would say that low tax burden, our economy since 1990 has grown at a slower rate than either our much smaller Midwestern neighbors or the nation as a whole.
Why?
Why? We're not making investments in the things the public sector has to make investments in, like education and infrastructure that attract high-end businesses. That's number one. Number two, because our fiscal system is so unstable, it is also unpredictable. I don't know of a business person in the world that likes an unpredictable tax system. They want to know what they're going to pay in taxes so that they could work it into their pricing structures and figure out what they have to do from that standpoint. The fact that we are unpredictable, that we are politically unstable, and that our state has failed to make adequate investments in education and infrastructure has put us behind our much higher tax Midwestern neighbors in economic growth for decades. And we got to figure it out. We have to pay our bills. And you got to go to your main taxes to do that, your income and sales.
I'll answer a couple things. One, on the pension thing, we believe that, as I indicated, it is true. They didn't fund the pensions. The other part is that they are richer than the average taxpayer, and that we are in a situation that, regardless of whether or not it was, it is rich or otherwise, is that we're in a situation where we're broke. Our estimate is if with a true economic cost, we're running about a $14 billion shortfall. And that requires us to look at various ways of reducing that shortfall. And that even when you do that, you're looking at, you can save about $2 billion in pension contributions if you do it to current employees. And we're saying defined benefit. We haven't even, our preference would be defined contribution, but we're saying take the defined benefit that we've had before, in essence, implement many of the reforms that were in the bill that was put out this year. Look at retiree health care, look at those other programs, and be able to scale back. The truth is the nature of our deficit is so large that everything's going to be on the table. With respect to the business climate, Illinois is rated 46th by the CEO Index as places to locate business. And it's for a variety of reasons. Yes. It has to do with many of the points that Ralph has identified. It is viewed as a place where it's difficult to get business done. The labor costs are very high. The taxes on a corporate basis are high. The educational system is not, you've got issues in some of the larger urban areas in terms of quality. But in terms of, quote, investment in the educational system is not actually one of the reasons why they're not doing it. But that Illinois is viewed as unfriendly to business.
So this sounds hopeless. I mean, should we just turn off the lights and give ourselves to Wisconsin or something?
No, you know what? Everyone, and including some of the more conservative organizations, in fact, including your organization, says there's no way out of this without a tax increase. And all of us have gone on record and tax increase along about the same level. You need to increase the state's income tax about 2 points. You need to expand the sales tax base to include services. Where our point of differences are, we at the CTBA don't feel cuts should be a substantial part of how we solve our current deficit problem, because we look at our investment in these essential public services, and we find them to be inadequate. And we find them to be inadequate across the board.
You can't cut your way out of this situation.
You know, now I get politically, I agree with, first I want to emphasize two things we agree on with Dea completely, and one is the transparency issue. It is just a shame for voters and taxpayers in this state how this budget process is done. It's completely unaccountable, and in fact, most legislators have no idea what's in the budget when they vote on it. They're given a couple of hours to review a document that's thousands of pages long. They don't review it. Up or down, and they're told what to do by their leadership. That's trash. Everything will have to be on the table. We agree with Dea's comment there because it is a political process. But that said, really, when you look at what we spend our money on, by any metric, we are below an adequate level of education funding. We finally have data. You know, it's interesting. In the past, we put money into schools. We had no idea what it actually cost to achieve certain academic outcomes. Well, now there's been a couple of methodologies out there. My organization did one. It's in our Money Matters report that 3 academic journals have picked up. It's a statistically significant finding that shows that the instructional expense per kid has to be about $7,300 to get high-end academic achievement. There's a direct statistical correlation that's significantly statistically significant, and we're nowhere near that across the state. To get to that level, it would cost $2.1 billion more than what we're doing today, and that doesn't account for poverty. And you need to do a lot more to get good academic outcomes. So, yeah, we've put some more money into schools, but we never knew what it would cost to have a quality education. Now that we know the metric, it's you know, let's go fund the metric. Let's not cut education.
Right. I have to interrupt because as stunning as it seems, we've just burned a half an hour here. We've got about a minute left.
I think there are a couple very important points. Illinois is broke. We've got a $14 to $15 billion deficit. We have to run government more effectively, review every program, decide how it can be done more effectively. We brought in a number of consulting firms to help the governor on his Taxpayer Action Board. There are many recommendations there that have not been acted upon that could be. Secondly, we have to get at the retiree-related debt. I know that it's hard, but the truth is that we can't afford it, and it's richer than what our current taxpayers are paying. And then 3, we have to actually all work together to be able to make Illinois competitive, because the truth is we're losing jobs, and the reason why is because we don't have an environment that allows us to compete.
Doesn't favor it.
And that we need to be able to have jobs. And in terms of our support of a tax increase, what we have said is this, is that you have to enact these types of reforms to get that done, and when those are done, we'll consider the tax increase. Because what we've seen historically is there is an unwillingness to address the tough and make the tough leadership decisions that need to be done.
And if I could just follow up on that real quick.
You're going to have to follow up very quickly.
Preconditions seem to me silly at this point because everyone has acknowledged we need a tax increase of a certain magnitude or we can't solve our problems. There's a great variance of opinion on whether or not you can save much money, if any money at all, through efficiencies. Why don't we all do the difficult political thing that we all know we have to do and deal with those other things as we do it?
You see the energy that's here, and I wish we could just go on for another half an hour. There is so much to be talked about. Can we cut our way out of this? I don't know. Do we need more revenue? There certainly is an argument for that, but you might not hear that argument very much in the media. Dea, Ralph, thank you so much for an amazingly stimulating conversation. What I'm taking away from it is we can't necessarily just cut our way out of it, and taxes, that's a pretty hard sell to a lot of the population. We've got a lot more to discuss on this. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom, a community service of CAN TV, and we thank you so much for watching. Of course, you can find us here on cable, but you can also see this and other programs online at Blip TV. All you got to do is just go to Blip TV. Check us out there, or you can subscribe on iTunes. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you again for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on Chicago Newsroom.